All right, let me switch gears here. So last week we looked at mission and God's image. I'll take these off. It's not going to work. So we looked at the fact of humanity in God's image, and then sin, which upset greatly the way things, and the plan that God had created, and we had this situation of humanity in rebellion, so we looked at all the different ways that being created in the image of God, the things that come from that, the fact that humanity in God's image, the fact that we're created in God's image, created for a task, created in relationship, and the importance of all of those things. And then the fact where sin affects every dimension of the human person. Sin affects human society and history. Sin affects the whole environment of human life. So we ventured off in several different directions just in looking at that. So we sort of continue on in this idea of humanity and rebellion. And one of the things that Christopher Wright talks about is a holistic approach. It requires a holistic missional approach when you are looking at the world and all of the things that we deal with in the world, and the fact that how do we respond? It was interesting when I was reading through this particular section, this chapter. We looked at when I was reading it. It literally starts by talking about a paradigm evil. And it talks about HIV and AIDS and the church's mission. And I was like, when was this thing written? Because it stunned me. I just assumed it was a recent. I don't know if there may be a more recent copyright, but this was written in 2006, I believe. So that makes 2006 better sense as to the topic. And I even talked to Bobby Lynn. I was like, I'm not sure how to make this mesh with the things that we've been talking about, because the HIV AIDS epidemic was somewhat in the past, and the fact that we have our own pandemic that we have been through with COVID. And so I thought, I don't know, because one carries a different stigmatism than the other. They carry different weights. There are similarities and there are differences on all those things. Were you getting ready to say something? Yeah.
I was just going to give an example.
Yeah.
How this plays out, this holistic thing. Even this week when we were at Coast Central on Monday, Betty was there. She probably had the same reaction. I don't think anybody said anything out loud, but we're doing a project. The high school kids are doing a project with younger kids.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is it's a vision board for the school year coming up, right? Where you put in front of you 2 or 3 goals for the school year coming up on board with pictures and, however you want to express it.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't Betty and I and others doing it. It's kids doing it.
Yeah.
So I bought these boards from Walmart that are about this tall, and the purpose was to cut them in half and buy half as many as we needed, because just walked up and sliced through, like, ruined the whole board, didn't do anything. And I said, that was terrible. That was not what I asked you to do. There's a process you go through.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to put that, I'm not.
Sure,
trying to
no,
put
no,
that
no.
down.
Yeah.
It's just, there's skills to living.
Yes.
It's not just sharing the gospel, but it is sharing the gospel to say, man, it's a good thing to learn how to do everyday skills.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes for the purpose of helping other people, sometimes, but when you've been through neglect and when you haven't had any parents and when you've been through a school system that does not care whether you learn, we can pretend it does, but it does not care at all
Right.
whether
Yeah.
these students learn. Then you come out with no confidence or skills of life.
Right.
And I think that's akin, that we've got an acute epidemic going on right in front of us
Mm-hmm.
of a generation of young people and generations of young people and adults
Mm-hmm.
that don't have the basic skills of life.
Yeah.
And the church's job is not, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about and arguing is, yes, we need to teach them. We went through and taught them the steps of how to cut something in half, the measuring. And, you know, then we would get to, it's 28 inches divided by 2, what is that? And nobody had any idea how to divide 28 by 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
These are high school students.
Yeah.
Nobody had any idea how to divide 28.
So that's when your eyes really see,
Wow. You know,
make the
but
connection.
The church's job is to do that plus make disciples of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Now, there's people that need to be about doing it. Sometimes as the church, we just said, well, we're going to teach everybody how to do 28 divided by 2. That's easier to do, and we feel better about that. But,
Mhm.
you know, I think that's what.
That's a great example. And what I started to do as I looked at it is I think it's the next slide. Yeah. So I said dimensions of mission in response to, in his book he says HIV, AIDS, whatever, and I thought to myself, COVID, whatever. And then I said, really, it doesn't necessarily we don't have to focus on the X. What we do focus on, because there are similarities in all of these things as we're trying to reach others as people who are created in the image of God, these things translate to all of those types of whatever X is. So that, like, for instance, on the handout, and I have a couple, if anybody didn't get a handout, I've got like 2 left. But on the back, there you go. No, just the first couple of slides were the same as last week. So if you flip to the second page, it'll be upside down. So those top 2 slides are the things that he listed as needing. These are the things that are needed. This is the approach. This approach is needed in response to the global situations we find ourselves involved in. It would seem it must include the following elements: sheer compassionate care. Pretty sure I have that. Yeah. Sheer compassionate care for the sick and dying. No disciple of Jesus should need to be persuaded of this. More extensive care for those whose lives are devastated in multiple ways by the effects of, and in all of these, I left in the word disease, but it's the X that I'm talking about. But more extensive care for those whose lives are devastated by X. Education of the infected, the affected, the churches, pastors, local civic leaders, and all who have a chance of influencing attitudes and behaviors. That's a good one, especially in light of what Tommy mentioned. And on over to the right, the next four, tackling and condemning cultural and religious practices that make the suffering worse, such as stigmatizing, ostracism, gender prejudice, and oppression. You see what I mean? These translate across whatever the pandemic, for lack of a better term, whatever the situation or the crisis that you're up against, these translate across the board. Offering and providing training for psychological and spiritual counseling and support for people at every stage, from a positive test result to the moment of death, and the support of the bereaved. Engagement in the economic and political dimensions of the issue for those whose calling is into the political sphere. So in other words, those who are interested in pursuing something in a civic way to help with the situation, we need those. So these are ways that you're coming at whatever this situation is, from all these different directions and all of these different things that translate to whether you're having a pandemic or the situation that as Tommy described it. Sensitive evangelistic witness to the new and eternal life that can be ours in Christ, with the forgiveness of sin, the hope of resurrection, and the certainty that death will not have the final word, was the very last one. So as you look over those and you think about what especially the example that Tommy just gave, how do those, do you think they do translate? Does it sound like they translate? Catherine, you're shaking your head, yeah?
You've got to start out somewhere, and helping people. Yeah. What you've already learned and everything, and sometimes just telling somebody something don't work, like with me. There are times when my daddy had to show me what he wanted done along with telling me what to do. And once he showed me what he wanted done, then I could do it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think probably all of us probably have a similar situation where we did not grasp something till somebody showed us how to do it. And then once that takes place, it's much, you're like, oh yeah, I got that. And it's easier then to also teach others, to show others, to explain these things to others. What else?
We have a good example of this in the first century Christians. When the church first started, and there were all these people from other areas, other countries in Jerusalem, but they saw to it that they were fed, that they had a place to stay.
Great example. Great example. They met needs.
Yes.
Whatever those needs were, they found a way to help and to meet the need. And we also have evidence that they were successful at it, because it said that no one had need, that everything that was needed was taken care of, was provided for. Great thought.
To help those who need help, to not worry so much about those who already have what they need and everything. But, you have to talk to them and everything so that they can use what they have to help others too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But to share what we have with others, whomever we come in contact with, whether it be somebody near or far
Yeah. Yeah, another great point. Anything else? Those are great. Those are great points, great examples.
Danny, that first one there is, I mean, we probably spend a month on that.
Yep.
We'll talk a little bit about that Sunday, but, man, examining ourselves as a church
Mhm.
in a very deep, thoughtful, and prayerful way to see where are we in the way of the gospel.
Can you think of a,
We assume we're not, and we're being lied to by Satan.
yep. Can you think of an example that I guess like an example that sort of makes the point as far as something that we may be doing. Bobby?
Well, I mean, people with disabilities, for one, there was a little family that came and they had a daughter and she made a lot of noise and it made her parents feel very uncomfortable. And I don't think anybody here was negative and they tried to bring a dog and I think they were more uncomfortable than, we're much more of a very loving environment. But, I mean, there's a lot of people who have disabilities who are different, who have different things, and whether it's them or us, I mean, but even if they had kept coming, there would have been people who would have been like, oh my goodness, she's gonna make noise, like, because it's not in our comfort zone.
Yeah.
And sometimes we, including myself, we don't handle that very well.
Yep.
Or if somebody's different, or maybe they, some people may not like, people saying stuff. I don't, whatever. I'm
Yeah.
just saying that
Yeah.
it's just, that's a way there, that's stigmatizing, it's ostracism. And most of the time, we don't really even do it. We don't do it overtly, but it's more,
Yeah, but sometimes we do it overtly thinking we're not,
yeah,
and we do it anyway. Or something is said
yeah.
that you're like, oh, you can't believe it.
And I'm just as guilty,
Sure.
guilty as anybody else.
Sure.
But, I mean, that's just something that came to mind.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point.
All right, I'm gonna say something now that we're gonna say, that was back when Mark did his sermon, and it came up about something in the book that he and that other man had written, and, it said something about, well, where would we be today if Jesus wasn't here and hadn't done all he done? And he said something about being out playing golf, and I opened my mouth and I said, oh, I'd be dead, I'd be lost. Yeah, if Jesus hadn't come and done everything, I'd be dead, I'd be lost,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I might be alive physically,
But spiritually not. Yeah,
it really made me give thought about it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Betty.
I'm just gonna explode if I can say out loud that part of us here as a congregation that accepts people with different cultural and other backgrounds. When Jackie first started worshiping, and she would be, amen, okay, because that's not me.
Yeah.
But Jackie has a way of inspiring others by
She does.
that, and that's us accepting all different cultures, because she teaches an awful lot through being able to do that. And I, every once in a while, I can actually go with her. Yeah, but
You join in with her and say,
and it's funny, she knows me anyway.
absolutely.
It's not a.
She does. She's like baby steps.
Yeah, it's I think that we can always do better in so many different directions. But
Yeah.
there's-
Yeah, for every situation where maybe we feel like we're doing a little better, there's a lot of areas where we're not.
But we are a lot further than we were when I was growing
Sure.
up, which I'm so thankful.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's where, I mean, that's fantastic, but that's also an attitude that can settle into the church. Well, we're not.
Oh, yeah.
We're-
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so-
It's a constant, yeah, it's a constant renewing where we readdress it again and say, where are we now? And
And I think as this culture goes along, I mean, we have so many people that are drug addicts and tattoos and, you know, they may accept Christ at some point and come into this building and come become a part of us and how we look at them and how we, you know, I think it's just an ever evolving process.
yeah, yeah. Well, if we say that we are created in the image of God, and we are, then that, what's that?
So is that person.
So is that person. And that's one of the things I talked about last week, was the fact that we are all created in the image of God. And so being able to look at ourselves honestly and say, where are we? What are we doing? Whether it's inadvertently or blatant, and being able to have the conversation without it being volatile. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But we're supposed to accept everybody at what they are at that point in time.
Yep. And of course, one of the things that makes that sort of makes things more difficult is when we have a nice orderly building with orderly seats and chairs, and I think back to first century, and that's not what I see. And so it's difficult in inviting in somebody who's not used to that environment, or someone who's not familiar with that environment, and being able to include and make that, extend that arm to everybody coming in, because it's just not the same, and everybody's not the same. So trying to figure out how we do that, and how we do it in a way that is building everybody up.
Helping those people who've never experienced that to experience some orderliness.
Sure.
And probably never have had. I mean, I can tell you lots of people that have never had it in their lives.
Yeah.
Any type of order, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes both ways. And secondly, we have to be intentional about it. We have to decide. You know, I think as it begins with leadership, and it says, hey, here's a way. We've got to keep expanding the mission of God. You know.
Yeah.
Here we've had this class, and we don't just have classes so we can have classes and say, hey, we had class.
Yep.
But what's God saying to us? So where's God leading us and teaching us in this class? Where's He taking us to? And man, here's a place where He's taking us to. You know, I don't mind just for a second giving you all a preview, but we've got 4 young men who just graduated from high school that we've known now for 12 years. And we've had lots of discussions and talks, but also they're guys who in that same don't even know how to divide 28 by 2 in their education history. Not saying anything bad about them, just saying they don't have. I mean, how are you going to have a career, and how are you going to have all of those kinds of things, other than you know? So their dreams are kind of this big about their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But we're about to start, and I'm going to talk about it Sunday in the sermon. We're going to gather around these 4 guys as a beginning point. Got them to this point, which is most of their peers.
Yes, yeah.
You know, and challenge them to something bigger. I'm going to ask the men of this congregation to join in with me, and let's raise these young men from this point on.
Yep.
And we've got a couple of young ladies, and people like Betty and Lynn, focus on them, but investing in time, investing in
Skills.
skills, investing in a dream, challenging them. You know, I've thought about, let's start a business together, and let's see where it takes us, and let's see, you know, there's so many things we can learn from starting a business. So,
Mhm.
you know, we can learn about money, and we can learn about organization, and we can learn about leadership, and we can learn about, you know.
Yeah.
And let's, as we study the Bible together, as we, you know, so anyway, yeah, I mean, what's around us, what's in us already,
Mhm.
you know, that now can be taken to a place that God makes us really uncomfortable with it, and really, but also God uses it for His glory. We've all learned over the year. I mean, we as a church could have an incredible ministry to people with special needs, because we've lived and been loved by people with special needs.
Right.
And been treated. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's something we have invested in the bank. You know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we can, you know. But anyway, yeah. I don't mean to talk so
No,
much.
because I mean, our classes, I believe, are the places where we need to be having these discussions, where we need to be able to talk and say, okay, here's what we're dealing with. That's not always, that's not necessarily something you would always want to do in a big corporate worship. That might not be the time to do it, but this certainly is where we can say, okay, here's what's before us. How can we address it? How can we pray for it? How can we, start the process? And I think, yeah.
Starts back to just love.
Mm-hmm.
And just remembering that we are in the image of God and that person is too. Now, Bobby Lynn and I have seen this in Serenity so much. These people don't know what love is. The same as Tommy's kids don't know family love.
Mhm.
Somebody cares for them,
And yeah.
and just showing them love, you can just watch it bloom.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody blossoms when they're in the presence of love, and when they experience love that is life changing, and they see something completely different than what they're used to, and they're like, that gives hope, and that gives encouragement. So, trying to figure out how to weave this. This is good. This is all good because see, most of my talk was around talking about whether it be a pandemic or whatever, the ways in which we have things that translate between whatever the situation is, that you still have to have all of these components, and they are still required of people made in the image of God and how they do it. And one of the points he talked about was the ultimacy of evangelism and the non-ultimacy of death. And in particular, because you're talking about pandemics in his chapter, then you're going to be talking about those who are at different stages through this illness or whatever it is. And so one of the things that he said, and then I want to jump to this next slide, the necessity of sensitive evangelism is clear and non-negotiable because it is the ultimate thing, the thing that holds all the other imperative responses. Those imperative responses were those 8 things we just read, or 7. The thing that holds all the other imperative responses together within a truly Christian worldview, in which death is not the ultimate thing. So while whatever it is, whatever X is, raises an exhausting list of temporary issues, the fact that however devastating the effects on people's lives here and now, there's also, for us, there is an eternity question, so that death is not the ultimate end. And so that's kind of where he was going with that, and trying to talk about the fact that through evangelism, we're providing hope and showing that death is not the final say. Jesus even said death doesn't have that final say. But the just kind of recapping some of the things that we had talked about, he reviews, he says, what we've learned so far. So far, we've scanned the broadest horizons of the great mission field of God, the earth itself, and then the human race. We've concluded that if our mission is to be true to God's mission, then it must embrace the wholeness of the earth and engage the wholeness of human existence and need. So when you think about some of the things we've been talking about, we realize these needs, the wholeness of human existence and need is all of those things we just described. Those are all things where if we are to be created in the image of God and meeting needs and seeing needs, then these are all of these areas are the areas where we're gonna focus. But then he jumps and talks about the fact that one of the things he said that the next focus, he then focuses on a section of the Bible that's often neglected when you're talking about mission, and in particular, he talks about wisdom literature. The problem is we can't say that because Tommy's already brought us lots of times into the wisdom literature, where we see that seeking wisdom, the wisdom of God, and all those things that go along with it are a part of understanding God's mission. So 3 things that he mentioned, and then we'll wrap up. And I'm hoping this makes somewhat of sense. So he talked about wisdom and culture and an international bridging that takes place. The wise was the term given to a class of people known across the ancient Near Eastern world, were those who were part of the wisdom culture. These people were renowned for their knowledge and sought out for their advice and guidance. And in some cases served in the courts of kings, functioned as administrators and government advisors. But he talked about that wisdom thinkers and writers in Israel participated in a very international dialogue with an openness to discern the wisdom of God in cultures other than their own. So they weren't only so wrapped up in their own culture that they weren't able to understand other people and where they are at and where they live. To me, this is one of those tangibles that we can have. We only know what we've grown up with. So we know what we're familiar with. We know what's common to us and what's comfortable to us. So when we hear somebody talk about the fact that they have gone through high school and they can't divide two numbers, we're just like stunned. We're like, why? It's like we can't understand that that could even be possible. That's one of those tangible things where meeting people where they're at, and a part of being created in the image of God means that you're able to meet people where they're at, and not just cruise along on your cruise control, and everything looks normal because everything is the same as it was yesterday and the day before, and all the things that I'm used to. When your world is rocked and your everyday is not normal, we experienced that when we traveled to work with Tommy for a month in Ghana. You talk about your world getting rocked. That rocked my world. And there were so many things that, because we were not in our culture, we did not understand their culture. And Tommy's on overdrive trying to explain their culture to us. That it was hard for us to understand, a lot of different things. But one of the things that we understood, and one of the things that we saw and experienced, and when we saw it and experienced, we realized this is doable, is watching the children there interact with our children. And it was seamless. There was no problem. In other words, our kids got right in there in the mix. They're playing basketball. They're running around playing soccer, even though Davis didn't know how to play soccer. But to watch, especially the way that they treated Camille. They treated Camille like she was a queen. They carried her everywhere. I don't think she walked while she was in Ghana. They carried her everywhere. So there, it was more about their culture teaching us than us teaching them, which is something. Anytime you experience, Dorothy, you've experienced this. Anytime, Sharon, you've experienced this. David and Lori have experienced it. Anytime you go to another culture and you don't know their culture, but the way that they treat you and the way that you are able to engage with them, it's beautiful. And that's the way things should be. So that's this international bridging that he's talking about in my words. Maybe not in his words, but that's what I think of when I talk about international bridging. The next was creational ethic. The most marked difference between the law and the prophets on the one hand and wisdom on the other lies in the motivational appeal that's characteristic of each. Again, this is talking about looking at wisdom literature for answers. And that's kind of what this last section was about wisdom literature. And he said the former appeal predominantly to Israel's redemptive history, whereas the latter appeals predominantly to Israel's convictions about creation, what they learned and know about creation, versus the redemptive history about how God delivered them from Egypt and all of those things that took place. That it were the things that they came to know about God through creation, which was one of those again, this ethic of how you approach. Yes, exactly. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And then the last one was an honest faith. And this one is probably the most relatable to us, but I think it's probably the most important, is an honest faith. And yet this may, let me read the first part of this before I'll just read it the way he wrote it. Finally, listening and the more questioning, struggle, and the voice. I have no idea what that sentence is saying. The most challenging difference between wisdom and the rest of the Old Testament traditions arises when some voices within the wisdom literature seem to clash with declarations in other parts of the Old Testament. One typical area is the tension between, on the one hand, affirmations, such as abound in Deuteronomy and Psalms, that obedience to God is the road to blessing and success in every area of life, whereas the wicked will suffer his anger and punishment. And on the other hand, the simple observation that this is often not true in our own experience. We may warm to the words, and I'm quoting from him, we may warm to the words of Psalms 146, but things suddenly feel very different when we read Job 24, 1 through 12, in which we see a scorching, truthful depiction of the real world, and come to verse 12 that says, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. Those were Job's words. We then echo the baffled question of the opening verse, why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? And then he goes on to say, and yet this may be precisely part of the purpose of the presence of this wisdom material in the canon of Scripture, to compel us toward an honest faith that's willing to acknowledge the existence of doubts we cannot entirely dismiss and questions we cannot satisfactorily answer within the limits of our experience or even the limits of the revelation God has chosen to give us. So this idea of to compel us towards an honest faith that's willing to acknowledge that we have doubts and that sometimes we don't understand why we deal with some of the things we deal with, or why certain communities are experiencing some of the things Tommy brought out at the beginning of class. And we don't understand why that is. And the fact that we are allowed to read Psalms where they cry out to God saying, where are you? I don't understand this. And having the realization that that's okay. It is okay for us to have questions. It's the way in which we grow by asking the questions. If we don't understand, we ask, and we're honest about our faith, so that we're not just walking around just quoting truths and having no impact on anybody else around us. Does that make sense? That's kind of basically what I'm trying to summarize and say, is that if we are not able to have those questions, then I don't think we have an honest faith. Does that make any thoughts on that? Sharon, were you going to say something?
I'm not sure that my thinking is correct, so please correct me if it's not right. But to oversimplify this, to me, it seems like the difference is the law and the prophets, and that type of thinking is more about how we're going to do something.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you do it. You know, you went through Deuteronomy and Leviticus and explained how we're going to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you get into the wisdom literature, it's more about the why.
Mhm.
This is why we're gonna do this, because God loves, because God cares, because of compassion. We're made in His image, so we need to be doing these things for those same reasons.
Yeah.
And you have to, sometimes, just like you would do with a 5-year-old, you might have to explain, this is how we're gonna do it.
Sometimes you use the law, and sometimes you use
Or you
the
can
prophets.
get to the wisdom of why we're doing it that way.
Yeah,
you know.
that's not an oversimplification. That's a great analogy. I think that's spot on because you need both.
Yes.
You've got to have both.
And there are times when you need the instructions, and there are times when you need the wisdom, and I think the longer you live and the more you experience things in your life, you can glean more of the wisdom
Oh
of
yeah,
why things are done, which doesn't mean you're gonna know everything before you die.
Exactly.
Because there will still be questions.
still going to be questions.
This is, got a type of bibliography tonight about this, and then I'm done with my paper. You know, 60 pages on all this, but, wisdom literature doesn't really provide answers. Proverbs presents a best case and says, love God, the why, fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And it says lots of things like, do good stuff and you'll be wealthy, and work hard and you'll get blessing from your hard work and all that. And, generally that's all true. Except then Job comes along and says, no, not really. That's not been my experience.
Right.
And Ecclesiastes comes along and says, it's all really pretty meaningless, even if you do work hard and get stuff.
Mhm.
So what?
Yep.
It's kind of like smoke floating around, is what Ecclesiastes says, till the end,
Right.
when the conclusion comes. And I think the world and sin lives in this tension of, there's a right way to do things, and there's a good way to do things, and, it leads to success mostly. But there's just some things that flat out just don't compute or make sense, or are not until they're closely examined and look like. It's not just by random accident, and not because they're stupid that the children can't divide two. There's reasons, systemic reasons
Yeah.
that go back for,
Mm-hmm.
and they're deeply embedded, sinful, selfish things that have happened that only the gospel can get out.
Yep.
And here's the thing that and we haven't gotten to this. Man, you've done such an amazing job tonight, by the way, of explaining all this. But then we come to Jesus, and Paul keeps telling us, wisdom is right there in Jesus. If you want to see, and when Paul's thinking wisdom, he's thinking Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job.
Mhm.
That's what he's.
That's wisdom
where his
to him.
mind
Yeah.
wraps, and he says, but it's all summed up in Jesus. And he says in Colossians, all the hidden treasures of wisdom are in Jesus. All the wisdom of God in Corinthians is in Jesus, as compared to the foolishness of man.
Mm-hmm.
And so, really and truly, we have to be somewhat careful of saying Old Testament wisdom provides so many. It provides a picture of a broken world.
Yep.
That of a world that God made, like you said, creation that God created, and everybody has access to all that wisdom and all that good. They can see it and sense it and talk about it, and everybody can, whether they're a Jew or not. The
Right.
Jews have some special things to do to show the world more of God's wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
I think the full picture then comes in Christ, and then what that makes us is we're the expression. We as the church are the expression of Christ's wisdom. We're what wisdom now looks like.
We're the next step in that.
Yeah,
getting that out, that wisdom
Full
out.
wisdom has been revealed in Christ and the cross.
Yeah.
And I think
And
that's.
Paul
what it's
specifically
trying to
says
say.
cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point, and that's a great way to wrap it up, because I think ultimately that's what it boils down to. The fact that all wisdom he was the embodiment of wisdom, was and is, and yet we're the next mechanism to make that known to the world, to demonstrate it to the world. Great points. We went over, so we're done. But thank you guys. Thank you for letting me veer completely off course and have a better class than what I had planned. So